Imagine this. On a dark and stormy night, a young man named Luke finds himself alone in his isolated house in the countryside. The house, old and creaky, had belonged to his family for generations, and the stories of ghosts and mysteries surrounding it had been passed down from father to son. Despite his grandmother's warnings, Luke had decided to spend the night there, determined to prove that there was nothing to fear. The pouring rain and howling wind created an unsettling atmosphere as Luke settled in the living room, trying to distract himself with a book. But every creak of the house seemed amplified, and every shadow cast by the lamp's light appeared to move. He tried to convince himself it was all in his imagination, but an uneasy feeling grew inside him. As the night wore on, the storm grew more violent. A lightning flash briefly lit up the room, revealing a vague figure in the mirror above the fireplace. Luke jumped, his heart pounding, but when he looked again, there was nothing. Just my imagination, he told himself. But fear was beginning to take hold. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs broke the silence. It was a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone walking slowly. Luke stood up, trying to convince himself it was just the wind moving something. However, curiosity and a sense of duty pushed him to investigate. With a flashlight in hand, Luke climbed the creaky stairs, each step echoing throughout the house. Reaching the top floor, he found himself in front of his grandmother's old room, which had always been locked. But that night, the door was slightly ajar. With his heart in his throat, Luke gently pushed the door, making it open completely with a sinister creak. The room was cold and dark, and the air was filled with a stale odor. Luke's flashlight revealed old furniture covered with dusty sheets and cobwebs hanging from the ceilings. An antique mirror stood in a corner of the room, and as Luke shone the light on it, he saw that vague figure again. This time, though, it seemed to be looking directly at him. Terror paralyzed him for a moment, but then he forced himself to move closer. The figure in the mirror became clearer, a woman with long dark hair and a sorrowful expression. Luke recognized the face of his great-grandmother, who had died mysteriously many years before. Family legend said her spirit had never left the house, seeking peace. But before he could do anything else, a whispered voice filled the room. "Help me." With trembling hands, Luke picked up an old diary he found on the dresser next to the mirror. The pages were yellowed with age, but the writing was still legible. His great-grandmother had written about her sorrows, her fears, and a secret she had to protect at all costs. There was a mention of an amulet hidden in the house, which could free her tormented spirit. Determined to end the curse, Luke began searching for the amulet, following the clues in the diary. His search led him to the basement, a place he had always avoided because of its sinister appearance. He descended the dark, damp stairs, the flashlight flickering and illuminating only a few steps ahead. After what felt like an eternity, he found an old wooden box hidden behind a partially collapsed brick wall. He opened the box and found the amulet, a silver pendant with an ancient symbol set in the center. As soon as he took it in his hand, he felt a wave of warmth and a sense of calm enveloped him. Returning to his great-grandmother's room, Luke held the amulet in front of the mirror. The figure in the mirror began to dissolve, a sad but grateful smile forming on the woman's face. Then, with a final whisper of gratitude, she vanished, leaving the mirror empty. The storm outside began to calm, and Luke felt that the house had finally found peace. Exhausted, he sat on the dusty bed, his heart still pounding but with a sense of relief. He had faced his fears, discovered the family secret, and freed a tormented soul. So, on that stormy night, Luke learned that sometimes ghost stories hide forgotten truths, and that courage can free not only spirits but also those living in the shadow of their secrets. The house, now silent, seemed to breathe easier, as if the weight of centuries had been lifted. The next time you find yourself alone in an old creaky house, remember that shadows may hide untold stories, and true courage lies in seeking the truth despite the fear. Until next time, may your nights be serene and your days filled with light. Imagine this. A young woman named Sarah moves into a quaint old house on the outskirts of a small town. The house, with its ivy-covered walls and ancient wooden beams, had always captivated her. She bought it for a surprisingly low price, unaware of the dark history it held. The previous owners had left abruptly, and the townsfolk whispered about the eerie events that had transpired within its walls. But Sarah, an avid skeptic, dismissed these tales as mere superstition. On her first night alone in the house, a thunderstorm raged outside. The wind howled through the trees, and rain lashed against the windows. Sarah sat in the living room, unpacking boxes, the only light coming from a few scattered candles and the occasional flash of lightning. The electricity had gone out, adding to the ominous atmosphere. As she unpacked, she found an old journal wedged in the back of a drawer. Curious, she sat down and began to read. The journal belonged to a woman named Eliza, who had lived in the house over a century ago. Eliza wrote about strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, disembodied whispers in the night, and a shadowy figure that seemed to watch her from the corners of the room. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine but shrugged it off. "It's just an old story," she told herself. She continued reading, captivated by Eliza's account. According to the journal, Eliza had discovered a hidden room in the basement, a place where the previous owner had conducted dark rituals. Eliza had tried to seal the room, but the disturbances only grew worse. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house. Sarah jumped, dropping the journal. The noise seemed to come from the basement. Her heart pounding, she grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the basement door. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended into the darkness. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with a musty smell. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing old furniture and boxes covered in dust. She searched for the source of the noise but found nothing out of place. Then she noticed a faint outline of a door in the far wall, almost hidden by a large cabinet. With considerable effort, Sarah moved the cabinet aside, revealing the hidden door. Her hands trembled as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a circle of burnt candles, and strange symbols were etched into the floor. The air was colder here, and Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of dread. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Panic set in, and she fumbled for her phone, using its dim light to find her way. She heard a whisper, soft but clear. "You shouldn't have come here." Terrified, Sarah tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she felt a cold breath on her neck. She turned around and saw a figure standing in the shadows, its eyes glowing in the darkness. With a surge of adrenaline, Sarah pushed against the door with all her might. It finally gave way, and she stumbled back into the basement, slamming the door behind her. She could still hear the whispers, muffled now but persistent. Racing up the stairs, Sarah grabbed the journal and ran out of the house into the pouring rain. She drove to the local library, determined to find answers. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, listened to Sarah's frantic account and nodded knowingly. She led Sarah to a dusty section of the library filled with old town records. Together they discovered that the house had been built by a man named Jonathan Blackwood, a notorious occultist who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. The townspeople had always believed the house was cursed, but no one had been able to prove it. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah returned to the house the next day, determined to confront the darkness within. She performed a cleansing ritual she found in one of the old books, hoping to banish the lingering spirits. As she finished the ritual, the atmosphere in the house seemed to lighten, and the oppressive feeling lifted. That night, the storm had passed, and the house was quiet. Sarah sat in the living room, feeling a sense of peace for the first time since she moved in. She knew that the house would always have its secrets, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. So, dear reader, remember that sometimes the most ordinary places can hold the darkest secrets. And if you ever find yourself alone in an old house on a stormy night, Be cautious of what you might uncover. Until next time, may your nights be free of whispers and your days filled with light. Imagine this. Michael, a software engineer in his late 20s, moves into a newly purchased house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house, built in the early 1900s, had stood empty for years before he bought it. Its charming facade and spacious interior seemed perfect, but the neighbors spoke of strange occurrences that had driven previous owners away. Michael, a rational man of science, dismissed these stories as baseless rumors. On his first night alone in the house, a thick fog rolled in, enveloping the neighborhood in an eerie silence. Michael sat in his study, working late on a project. The only sound was the rhythmic tapping of his keyboard, occasionally interrupted by the distant hoot of an owl. As the night wore on, he decided to take a break and make himself a cup of coffee. Descending the grand staircase, he felt a sudden chill. The temperature seemed to drop as he reached the bottom step. Shaking it off as a draft, Michael continued to the kitchen. As he waited for the coffee to brew, he heard a soft humming sound, almost like a lullaby. He paused, straining to listen. The sound seemed to come from the living room. Michael walked into the living room, where moonlight cast long shadows through the tall windows. The humming grew louder, more distinct. He traced it to an old ornate mirror hanging on the wall, a relic left by the previous owners. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, yet filled with sorrow. He stood before the mirror, transfixed. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror shifted. Instead of seeing his own image, he saw a young woman in a white nightgown, her eyes hollow and her face etched with despair. She seemed to be looking directly at him, her lips moving as she continued to hum the lullaby. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he reached out to touch the mirror. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the woman vanished and the humming stopped. Shaken, Michael retreated to the kitchen, trying to rationalize what he had seen. Just my imagination, he muttered to himself. He took his coffee and returned to his study, determined to finish his work. But the eerie encounter left him on edge, and he found it hard to concentrate. As midnight approached, the house seemed to come alive with strange noises. The sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. Doors creaked open and shut, and whispers floated through the air. Michael's nerves were frayed, but he forced himself to stay calm. Old houses make noises, he reasoned. Then, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, save for the pale moonlight seeping through the windows. Michael grabbed a flashlight from his desk and decided to check the circuit breaker in the basement. He descended the creaky wooden stairs, each step echoing ominously. The basement was cold and damp, filled with old furniture and forgotten relics. He made his way to the circuit breaker, but as he reached for it, he felt a presence behind him. He turned, shining the flashlight around, but saw nothing. The air grew colder and he could see his breath forming in front of him. A whisper, barely audible, filled the room. "Help me." Michael's blood ran cold. He swung the flashlight around again and saw the faint outline of the woman from the mirror, standing at the far end of the basement. Her eyes pleaded with him and she repeated, "Help me." Gathering his courage, Michael asked, "Who are you? What do you want?" But she simply pointed to a small door he hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a stack of old boxes. With trembling hands, Michael moved the boxes aside and opened the door. Inside, he found a small, dusty room. At the center was a child's crib covered in cobwebs. A sense of overwhelming sadness washed over him as he approached the crib. Inside, he found an old, worn teddy bear and a locket. He opened the locket to find a picture of the woman and a child, both smiling happily. Suddenly, the woman appeared beside him, more solid now, her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "My baby. Bring her peace." Michael, understanding what he needed to do, took the locket and teddy bear upstairs. He placed the items on the mantelpiece in the living room, arranging them with care. The house seemed to sigh, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The woman appeared one last time, smiling sadly but gratefully before fading away. The power returned, and the house fell silent. Michael, exhausted but relieved, knew he had brought peace to a tormented soul. He sat down, reflecting on the night's events, and realized that some things couldn't be explained by science alone. So, dear reader, remember that even the most rational minds can encounter the inexplicable. The next time you find yourself alone in an old house, listen closely. You might hear whispers from the past seeking closure and peace. Until next time, may your nights be free of hauntings and your days filled with light.